So today I am going to speak, I'm describing my talk as when knowledge is not knowledge, when jnana is not jnana. The Hindu tradition, especially the traditions that are centered on the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, Brahma Sutras, the Vedanta tradition, is preeminently a tradition of knowledge or wisdom. It's a jnana tradition. This is the core, this is its heart. And we see so many passages in the tradition that emphasize that this is a tradition that is centered on wisdom. So the very famous line from Bhagavad Gita, nahi jnanena sadrisham pavitram iha vidyate, that there is nothing as powerful in this world as wisdom, as knowledge. And to describe the Hindu tradition as a tradition of wisdom or knowledge, jnana, is to imply that it is a teaching tradition, because this is how knowledge is imparted. So it follows, when we say it's a wisdom tradition, it implies that it's also a teaching tradition. Wisdom is shared, it is imparted in dialogue from teachers to student, through discussion from guru to the shishya. And so again, we see so many examples in the tradition. This is why the teacher has such an elevated and esteemed status in this tradition as the transmitter, the teacher of wisdom. So most of the Upanishads begin with students going to their teachers in search, asking for a teaching, beginning with a question to the guru, and then the discussion follows. We see the same thing in the Bhagavad Gita. Arjuna asks questions. So teach me is a constant refrain in the Upanishads. Why is wisdom so important? Why is jnana so significant in this Vedanta tradition? I think the reason is very obvious. It has to do with how the tradition understands what the fundamental human problem is. Every religious tradition has some proposal, some diagnosis about what is wrong with us. What is the human problem that needs to be resolved? What is the human problem that needs to be solved, for which this tradition is a solution? So the Buddha, said the problem is dukkha, it is suffering. So you read the Buddhist tradition and you see how the Buddhist tradition is in so many ways a response to a diagnosis of the human problem as one of dukkha or suffering. So every tradition, has some central teaching around which, some central understanding or teaching, diagnosis of the human problem. Sometimes crystallized around one word, whether it's sin, whether it's dukkha, and so on. So you always have to look at the solution in relation to what the problem is. The solution only makes sense if we are speaking about a particular problem. So in this case here, jnana or vidya, knowledge, becomes very important because of the diagnosis, because of the understanding of the human problem to be centrally a problem of avidya or of ajnana. So when we name the problem as one of ajnana or avidya, ignorance or lack of understanding, then we see why the emphasis so much becomes upon right knowledge, right understanding, on vidya or jnana. So of course we speak of Brahma jnana, the knowledge of, or Brahma vidya, the knowledge of the infinite or the wisdom about the infinite. So here we have a tradition that basically affirms that there is a certain misreading, a certain misunderstanding of ourselves, or misunderstanding in a larger sense about reality itself that has to be corrected, that has to be rectified. And it is not simple ajnana. When we think of avidya in Sanskrit or ajnana, both point to the same teaching. It is not simply a fact of not knowing. It is not a sort of an absolute not knowing. This not knowing is also comes along with certain misknowing or misunderstanding. So in Sanskrit, it is complete not knowing is called avarana. But then there is what we call viparita. There is wrong knowledge. So not only do we not know something, we think that we know and we understand incorrectly. So avidya has these both sides. It's not knowing but projecting falsely in addition. Now, if you have studied anything about Vedanta or you listen to the Vedanta discussion, you would have heard many examples being used. And today I want to choose one example that I think you may be all familiar with. So I'm just going to, how many of you have heard the example of the rope and the snake? Right. So if you studied Vedanta, this becomes the classical example of a problem of avidya and a solution of jnana. So it's an ancient example to illustrate this problem. So you know the example well. Someone is walking. There is the light is very dim, improperly lit area. An object is seen on the path, a long object winding, and so the person thinks it's a snake, right? And then goes closer and sees that it's not really a snake; it's a rope. So these are the two things that I had said. Not only is there a lack of knowledge of what it is, which is ignorance, but then taking the rope to be something else. So there was both concealing of what is there, but not simply concealment. The person didn't say there is something. The person said there is a snake. So you take the object to be something other than what it is. You project something in its place. So this is a sort of a classical example of avidya. And then of course when the snake is seen, problem goes away. It is solved. There's no longer the fear and the fright of having a snake on your path. So extending this example, and I'm not going to go too much into it, but in a similar way, the Vedanta tradition teaches that there is something about ourselves that we don't know. And not only do we not know, like we don't know the rope, but then we take it to be something other than what it is. So we don't understand the nature of the Atma, what we are truly, but we take it to be what it is not. And as you read the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads, you will see that this is at the very heart of the teaching. Correct understanding of who I am, what is the nature of the Atma. So, second chapter, Sri Krishna begins, because Arjuna has false notions about who he is and what is the truth of the self. You remember, he thinks it is born, it changes, it dies. So Krishna has to teach najayate, that this Atma is not born. Namriyate, it does not die. It does not change, or it is not subject to time. it is not the same as the body. It is not the same as the mind. Not that it is not related to these, but it is much more than physical self or mental self. So all of this whole teaching is centered on correcting a certain false understanding of self. And the same is in the Upanishads. All of the great sentences of the Upanishads that we speak of as the Mahavakyas, the great sentences, all seek to correct some misunderstanding. So, so Shvetaketu in Chandogya Upanishad has to be told by his father 12 times, Tat Tvamasi, that is what you are. Because he had a certain force. The father repeats, that thou art, Tat Tvamasi, to correct his understanding about who he is, what is the nature of the self. But here is where I want to come to the gist of what I want to say today. Coming back to this rope and snake example. I think that we have to be very much aware of how far an example goes and what might be the limits of examples that we use. So let us take, for example, go back to this very famous, or the most famous of the examples, which is the Raju Sarpa in Sanskrit, rope, snake. Sarpa is snake and Raju is the rope. So let us think a little bit about this example. So first thing in this example is that the rope is an object of perception. It is something that I see with my eyes, lying there. Right? It is a sense object. I see it lying there. And when I go closer to it, I see clearly, again, visually, an act of perception that it is not a snake, it is rope. And once that happens, I have no doubts. My doubts about what it is immediately dissipate in that act of perception. So my error there is an error of perception. I see something and I come to an incorrect conclusion about it. And when I see rightly, the doubt goes. I'm sure. I will keep on walking. Right. Immediately the problem is solved there and then itself. But in the case of the Atma, this true being, self that we're talking about, it is not an object of perception. It's not something that we see, like you see the rope and you take it to be a snake, and the problem is corrected as you go closer. The Upanishad says, that which the eyes cannot see, but because of which the eyes see. The basic teaching about the Atma in all of the Upanishads, including the Bhagavad Gita, is that it is not an object. Because if it is an object, then it becomes something in space and time. It becomes limited. It becomes like, my book that I can see. But Atma is not a object. It is not a thing like the rope that we see before us. So what this means is that this is why the process of teaching is very important. Because it is not an object, there are more doubts about what it is. Is it true what the Upanishads say? In the case of the rope snake, immediately there's no doubt. It's a very simple problem. But in this case, there are doubts. How could it be different how could it not be the body? When I feel pain, I think I'm hurting. How can you say it's not the mind? When I'm sad, I experience sadness. So because Atma is not an object, therefore it is subject to many more doubts about The teaching, in other words, is subject to more questioning and interrogation. There are more doubts about it because of its very nature. So this is one important difference in the example of the rope snake and in the teaching about the Atma. Second, taking a rope for a snake is not a problem that we have always had from birth. It's not a problem that we sort of kind of born with, always have had. It's not a long-standing problem that people have, that they always take ropes for snakes. Maybe there, I don't know. Maybe there is some kind of diagnosis. They have to have some special name for it. A group of people who always take ropes for snakes. I don't think so. So it's not a problem. It's always been with us. It may have happened occasionally when we are walking and the light is dim and we see something before us. But as I said before, it's quickly resolved once we see the object with our eyes. In the case of who we are, in the case of Atma, however, this is a very deeply ingrained problem. If you were born into this world, you were born not knowing who you are. We're all subject to it. It's a common problem. It's a common problem that we all share. Avidya is a human problem. It is always there with us. It just can't, it's going to be there as long as it's not replaced by vidya or jnana. So here, that's another difference between the example and the thing that we are seeking to speak about. Third important difference is that taking a rope for a snake is not an error with a lot of deep consequences. It's not very consequential. It doesn't mean, as I said, that I will see everyone as a snake or I'll see everything as a snake. It doesn't mean that if I mistake the rope for a snake, it's not going to affect how I relate to you, what my values are, how I live my life in this world. It's not a fundamental error like that shapes, who I am and how I engage people, how I see people, how I see the whole of reality. But taking my understanding of who I am is a consequential matter. It does affect me. It does affect how I live my life. It does affect how I see you. It does affect my fundamental values. It's a fundamental question, and it affects fundamental. The outcomes are fundamental. So if I misunderstand myself, if I take myself to be other than what I am, if I misunderstand reality, that shapes my habits, it shapes my values, it shapes the quality of my interactions with others, with the world. It's not a small matter as taking a rope to be a snake. You may think of other differences between the example and the subject matter, but those are the three that I want to highlight. So what do all of these differences mean for us when we come to this issue of self-knowledge, Atma Vidya or Brahma Vidya? It means that if the nature of the problem is different in this regard from the examples that we use, then we have to think why we use the example, why we say, this is a problem of avidya and vidya, ajnana and jnana. There are some fundamental differences. First, since avidya, that I'm speaking about, Atma avidya, is such a deep-rooted problem, unlike the rope snake problem. We are all subject to it. And it's lifelong, unless it's replaced by wisdom. This is my view as a student of the Vedanta tradition for all of my life. That unlike the rope-snake problem, the overcoming of Atma Avidya, self-ignorance, does not have the instantaneous character of correcting the rope-snake problem. Now, once you see that rope, it's over. In that moment itself, it's over. The problem is solved. Jnana solves the problem. After recognizing, the rope for what it is, you don't have to get up every morning and remind yourself that a rope is not a snake. It's not a mantra that you have to repeat. You don't have to do anything after that. The problem is gone. It's solved. But in the case of Atma Vidya and Atma Avidya, Atma Jnana, Atma Ajnana, because we are dealing here with a long established way of thinking, we are more likely to be forgetful. And even when we understand, we are more likely to think in past ways. The past habits of thought do not immediately go. This is what we speak of in Sanskrit as vasanas. You have the word vasana. A vasana is a long established habit. Emotional, it can be emotional, it can be mental. And vasanas are those long established dispositions to act, that even when you know otherwise, they still exert considerable influence. So we speak about vasana kshaya, the cleansing of vasanas, the removal of vasanas. So understanding understanding who I am is necessary, is important, but it does not end there. If that knowledge cannot be employed in a way that transforms me, it is not knowledge. So I mean when I say knowledge is not knowledge. This knowledge is valuable only when it really becomes transformative knowledge. I can give you so many examples of that. So here we can speak therefore of the practice of knowledge. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna speaks about jnana abhyasa. Jnana abhyasa. The discipline of knowledge, the practice of knowledge. Knowledge has to be constantly, it's a practice, it's a discipline. And only when it becomes a practice, can we neutralize those long ingrained habits, or what we speak of as vasanas. In other words, as a fundamental teaching of this tradition about the self, is that the idea of separate selfhood is a wrong understanding of self. That the Atma is identical in all. Right? And the consequence of that is that I have to learn to look, we all, in the process of growing up, we all develop prejudices, right? Preferences about human beings. We don't always value all human beings equally on the basis of many kinds of criteria. These are habitual ways, unfortunately, habitual ways of thinking. But now if I understand, at least, that in all beings there is one being, which is also my own true self. Now that's a teaching that now has to transform how I see human beings. My attitude towards others. I have to see that unity that is there. But that takes practice. That takes mindfulness. I have to be conscious when avidya vasanas reassert themselves in what I might say, or in the way I might relate to people who are different from me, or who I regard, unequally. Knowledge has to become transformative in that sense, and that doesn't happen whether it's a sannyasin or a lay person. Doesn't happen overnight. Changing the color of my clothes does not immediately change how I think. It may indicate that I want to change, I hope to change, but it doesn't mean that the change has come because I've changed, how I dress now. So this, I want to emphasize, this jnana abhyasa that Krishna speaks about, the practice of knowledge. It's not necessary in the rope snake instance, but in the case of Atma, knowledge has to become a practice. It's a discipline. It's a practice. And here I think we have, as members of the Hindu tradition, we have a lot to learn. I have found in my own study that the Buddhist tradition has done a lot of work on this, especially in the practice of compassion and various kinds of compassion meditations. We also have that value. We say that, that the wise person is also a compassionate person. But how about, what about in terms of meditation practices to cultivate compassion? Buddhism is closely related to the Hindu tradition, but they've just given a lot of attention to this and developed very specific practices, to deal with hate and to cultivate those kinds of meditation, mindful meditation practices to help us to grow in compassion. And we need those kinds of practices. So in other words, knowledge is a process. Another way of thinking of knowledge as a discipline is to say that knowledge is a process. And I would say a lifelong process. It's a lifelong process. It's a lifelong process that requires, daily work on ourselves. Daily work on ourselves. We can't afford to be unmindful. This is what, at the heart of the religious life is this cultivation of this mindfulness that is itself a discipline. The process of replacing avidya influenced ways of thinking with knowledge or wisdom. Because knowledge is not knowledge unless it changes our way of thinking and acting. It simply remains words that we know, we are familiar with. And I think in this process, we can see, I see two components when we think of the meaning of wisdom or jnana. When it is transformative, it frees us from. So there is a freedom from. And we see a lot of discussion of this in the sacred text and in the lives of great teachers. The Upanishads have this very beautiful expression in the Upanishads. And Shankara often cites that. It's Hridaya Granthi. Hridaya is the heart. And Granthi means the knot, K-N-O-T, the knots of the heart. The knots of the heart. So wisdom is supposed to loosen the knots of the heart. Avidya is compared to the binding of the heart in knots. And wisdom releases or loosens these knots of the heart. And what are these knots? When you look at the text, these are the knots of greed. One of the first knot that avidya ties the heart with is karma, is the knot of greed. Not legitimate needs or wants. There's a difference between, legitimate needs and wants and greed. Greed is insatiable. That's the difference. It can never be satisfied. And that becomes a knot. So wisdom is supposed to free us from, release that knot of karma. And the knot of krodha. It's not a knot of anger. Responding to the world with anger. And very often in these texts, anger is closely related to greed. It's a frustration of greed, or almost inevitably leads to a response of anger towards others. So kama, krodha. And greed leads to greedful actions, which often are violent actions to accomplish, the things that I want. So avidya, kama, karma in this sense would be greedful actions. So there's a loosening process. These granthis, the freedom from these knots that bind the heart. So in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna gives beautiful portraits of the freedom from these knots. Adveshta sarva bhutanam. In whom the knots of the heart have been loosened, has no hate. Adveshta sarva bhutanam, is free from hate. Maitra karuna evacha, is a friend of all. Is karuna, is compassionate. Nirmamo, nirahankara, is not possessive. It is not self-centered. All now there's a freedom from these knots. But the second part of it's of freedom from, but we also have to remember freedom for. It is not only freedom from, but freedom for. Because freedom from, can always not necessarily, it should not necessarily be understood in this way. It can become rather, it could be a kind of a negative. I have no anger. I have no greed. Now the question is, what have you replaced those with? What have you replaced those with? I don't hurt anyone. I practice ahimsa. Ahimsa. Even Gandhi had to remind that ahimsa is not a negative value. It is not simply abstaining from hurting others. It's also positive. So freedom for is the positive side of freedom from. So, in other words, certain values have to be replaced, have to be loosened, and they must now be replaced by, if I am, and you can see in that beautiful verse, Adveshta Sarva Bhutana. So he starts off by saying that the person whose knots are loosened is without hate. But in case the hearer misunderstands, he says, Maitri Karuna Evacha. But is compassionate towards others, unfriendly. In other words, it's not without hate in a kind of an isolated way that I'm not engaging the world. But there's a new way of engaging the world, which is infused, with love, infused with compassion, infused with shantimapnoti. This is the positive side. So this spirituality has to have this positive side. It's not simply withdrawal, but a new way of engaging which is the freedom for. Loving kindness, loving compassion is the new way of that engagement. So to put it in another way, simply is to say that here we are speaking about knowledge that must become a way of being. Knowledge, knowing and being must coincide. For knowledge to be knowledge, there must be a unity of knowledge, of knowing and being. Knowing and being. And this is where the work of self-transformation is. And it's not a matter of being cruel or harsh to oneself. It's a matter of understanding, how avidya has established itself in such a profound and deep way in our habitual ways of thinking, and how jnana must now be a new process of remaking ourselves, of transforming ourselves. And I do think that we don't give enough attention to that work that is necessary, that daily work that is necessary, and where religion really is, where it is all about. The self-transformation is where the potential of religious traditions really ought to be found. It's a challenge for all of us. I mean, what I'm saying, I don't claim that this is anything new. The Upanishads, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad says, when it speaks about this knowledge, it says it has to be heard, Sravana, from the teacher, Manana, you have to think about it, you have to reflect about it, it requires the engagement of your mind. So you have to hear, you have to apply, you have to commit yourself deeply to thinking and reflection and clarity of understanding. But it mentions even the third step, nididhyasana, which is where I think the transformation, the process of transformation. Nididhyasana is constant practice. The practice of wisdom is nididhyasana, sravana, manana, nididhyasana, threefold processes of wisdom that lead to transformation. And there are many beautiful verses of caution on this matter. Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, yatato hyapi kaunteya purushasya vipaschitaha indriyani pramathini haranti prasabham manaha. So yatato means even the most virtuous, or one who is seen as the most virtuous, yatato, constantly working at this. Yatato hyapi kaunteya purushasya vipaschitaha, even a very exalted person. Purushasya vipaschitaha. Indriyani pramathini. Speaking here of the force of habitual ways of acting. Indriyani pramathini haranti prasabham manaha. Can be swept away. In a moment of unmindfulness, a moment of lack of vigilance, even the wise one can lose his or her balance and be swept away. And we see this, history is full of examples of it. It's a very wise observation, very wise point here in the text, where he emphasizes, I'm not talking about, someone who's a beginner, I'm talking about someone who's well along the way. Yatata, Purusha vipaschitaha, even such a person. Can't give up on vigilance, can't give up on mindfulness. So, to conclude, this is what I wanted to emphasize: the unity of knowledge and being, knowledge as a process, the differences between the example and what we're trying to, the rope, snake, rajju, sarpa, and atma jnana, atma vidya. It's just that I think, we can't speak superficially or flippantly about knowledge without realizing how that knowledge is challenging. Knowledge makes demands on us if we take it seriously. Because it's so easy, to try to justify one's prejudices, one's attitudes, rather than to challenge them. But if our religious traditions don't challenge us, and if they simply justify, we look to them simply to justify, our prejudices or habitual ways of thinking, they don't serve us. They don't serve us. What they do promise is that it opens us to a more fruitful and flourishing way of being. It may seem very difficult, but the promise is at the end of it, or along the way as well, that there is a deeper, richer, more joyful way of being when wisdom transforms us, when knowledge becomes what it is meant to be, true knowledge.